In the first scene, we see Mr. Royal Snow negotiating the purchase of a very important item in Barlow and Straker's antique shop. Today at 6 in the evening, a large crate will be brought to the pier. Snow must be there at the time of arrival and immediately load the crate into his truck. Mr. Straker emphasized that this item is one of a kind. Then Snow is to deliver the crate to the infamous Marston house on the hill and take it to the basement. Snow acted exactly as instructed. About the Marston house, people still spread sinister rumors in town. Marston, who was a cultist, took his wife's life before doing the same to himself. Mr. Snow's companion, Hank, was visibly uncomfortable with what was happening, but they couldn't afford to back out. The crate turned out to be heavy, and the men struggled to carry it into the basement. According to the documents, it was a dresser. Hank accidentally dropped the load, and it cracked. It seemed that the crate was filled with dirt. Snow didn't even want to know what that meant. The men continued to carry the crate deeper into the basement. When they set it down, suddenly someone began calling Royal's name in a menacing whisper. As if hypnotized, he approached the crate, but Hank's voice snapped him out of his trance. Today on September 23, 1975, writer Ben Mears returns to his hometown of Jerusalem's Lot, Maine. Constable Parkins Gillespie advised the young man not to get into trouble here. Ben said he came for inspiration, not adventure, and continued on his way. This is the town where he was born, and it seemed that everything remained the same. The first thing the young man did was go to a real estate agency to rent a place. The attractive secretary Susan Norton was just reading his book. Agency owner Larry Crockett personally greeted the guest. Ben asked if someone had really bought the Marston house, considering the place's bad reputation. As an experienced realtor, Larry Crockett managed to sell the house that had stood vacant for 40 years. The new owner is Mr. Straker, the manager of the antique shop. Obviously Ben was a local if he knew about the Marston house. The young man confirmed he did indeed live here until he was 9. Hearing his name, Susan guessed that he was a famous writer. The girl said that Eva Miller had a few rooms for rent. Thanking her, Ben left. Susan was extremely thrilled by this encounter. Eva Miller showed Ben his room, pointing out that guests were not allowed. Ben was perfectly fine with that. Life in the town went on as usual. In school, bully Richie Bowden was picking on his peers. However, this time a new boy in their class, 12-year-old Mark Petrie, managed to fight back. The school principal, Matt Burke, witnessed the fight and immediately broke up the boys. Richie ran off in disgrace, and Mark promised the principal it wouldn't happen again. Later, Mr. Straker watched from his shop window as the local boys walked along the street. In the library, Ben was studying old newspapers from the archive. Susan came here with her mother, and Norton, who scolded the daughter for turning down yet another suitor. Library worker Mabel Wirtz nodded toward Ben Mears, who was sitting at a computer, saying he was a famous writer. About 20 years ago, his parents had perished in a car accident in this town. Mabel was sure that Ben was gathering material for his new book, otherwise, he wouldn't be spending so much time at the library. When Mabel asked Susan about her plans for the evening, she deliberately loudly replied that she was going to the open-air cinema. Catching the hint, Ben chuckled quietly. Meanwhile, the boys were watching a vampire horror movie. Mark's new friends, Danny and Ralph Glick, warned him about Richie Bowden, who had an older brother. But Mark wasn't afraid. He was ready to stand up for himself again if he had to. Learning that Ralph was afraid of the dark, Mark gave him a harmonica. Whenever Ralph felt scared, it would calm him down. To clear his mind, Ben decided to visit the open-air cinema, where he hadn't been since childhood. Of course, he wasn't at all surprised to run into Susan. On weekend evenings, nearly all the town's residents gathered here. The sun was already setting, which meant the movie would start soon. Susan suggested that Ben follow her to the secret spot, where the view of the screen was the best. Meanwhile, as Ralph and Danny were walking home from Mark's, Mr. Straker pulled up beside them in his car and offered them a ride. The boys politely declined and continued walking on foot. Straker watched them as they walked away. Susan told Ben about some of the town's most interesting residents, including the local priest, Callahan, who was constantly getting drunk. Susan also shared a little about herself. She dreams of obtaining a realtor's license and moving to Boston, but the mother, who is still mourning her husband who passed away a year ago, is firmly against it. Ben in turn shared that after losing his parents at 9 years old, he moved in with relatives. Now he's returned to find himself. It was almost dark, and the boys hadn't made it home yet. They were forced to go through the woods to avoid another encounter with Mr. Straker. The boys didn't notice someone following them. Suddenly this person grabbed Ralph. Danny desperately called out for his brother, but he was already too far away. Mr. Straker brought Ralph in the trunk of his car to the Marston house, saying that the master needed a sacrifice. Candles were burning all around the house. Straker, a devoted servant of Barlow, called upon his master. Suddenly all the candles went out, and the floorboards began to creak. Immobilized Ralph heard sinister breathing close by. Watching this, Straker barely contained his emotions. Father Callahan once again ended up at the police station for drinking in public. Constable Parkins was already used to it. He also mentioned that the Glick's son was missing, and a search party was being organized. The presence of a priest would be much appreciated. A week later, the search for missing Ralph continues but to no avail. Floyd Tibbetts, who's in love with Susan Norton, told Ben to get the hell back to New York. Matt Burke on the other hand showed friendliness toward Ben, mentioning that the schoolchildren would love to meet a celebrity. Ben was glad to be of service. Not only Floyd, but other townsfolk were also displeased to see a stranger in their area, associating his arrival with Ralph's disappearance. However, Ben wasn't worried, as he had a solid alibi. Susan said that there were rumors Parkins was planning to call off the search, as he didn't believe Ralph could be found alive. People found it hard to accept this. That evening, Anne saw from her window as Ben dropped off her daughter. Susan understood that the mother wouldn't approve of her relationship with a guy from New York no matter what. Ralph's brother Danny couldn't fall asleep. At some point he thought he saw someone outside the window. He approached to check. Could it be Ralph? The fog made it impossible to see anything, so Danny went outside, calling for his brother. The fog covered everything around him. Suddenly someone threw an object at Danny's feet, and the swing in the yard started moving on its own. Danny still hoped it was Ralph playing a trick on him. Before Danny could figure it out, someone grabbed him. Some time later, the boy complained to his mother that he wasn't feeling well. Danny ended up in the hospital in critical condition. Dr. Cody explained to his parents that Danny's red blood cell levels were dangerously low and dropping rapidly. During the night, Danny's condition worsened. The mother, who hadn't left his ward for a second, asked her son what was wrong. Danny wheezed that he was thirsty. Marjorie Glick immediately called for the nurse, but it turned out that Danny wasn't craving water. Danny didn't survive. The funeral was to be held today. Father Callahan offered the gravedigger Mike Ryerson a drink, saying that on days like these, it's not a sin. The Glicks have lost both their sons, and the entire town mourns with them. During the funeral, Mike stood aside, hearing the grieving cries of Danny's parents and the priest's prayers. Mike didn't even notice when he dozed off right there in the cemetery. By then it was already dark, and Mike was supposed to have covered the grave long ago. Suddenly knocking sounds started coming from the coffin as if someone was trying to get out. When Danny began calling for help, Mike immediately climbed down into the pit, but Danny was completely lifeless. Thinking he had imagined it, Mike continued covering the grave. At one point Danny disappeared from the grave, and moments later attacked Mike. The next day as promised, Ben spoke to the school's students. No one mentioned the tragedy in the Glick family anymore, as if nothing had happened. In the evening after work, Matt went to the bar and noticed Mike sitting alone at a corner table, breathing hoarsely and looking extremely pale. The gravedigger told Matt he had lost consciousness after Danny Glick's funeral and remembered nothing since. Now Mike was very scared. Dr. Cody had already gone home, but Matt couldn't leave Mike alone in such a state and invited him to spend the night at his place. Mike gratefully accepted the offer. Seeing bite marks on the guy's neck, Matt grew concerned. Mike had no idea how they got there. Now it was Matt's turn to be afraid. That night was sleepless. Suddenly Matt heard a child's voice asking to be let in. He went outside and saw a boy sneaking through the second-story window. In the middle of the night Eva Miller woke Ben up, saying Matt Burke was waiting for him downstairs. Eva, by the way, noticed Susan hiding by the doorway. Matt immediately asked Ben if he had a crucifix or a St. Christopher's medallion. Neither Ben nor Susan understood what was going on. Matt asked them to follow him, insisting his house had been attacked by creatures of the night, vampires. Naturally it sounded too insane to believe. Matt and his companions quietly entered the house. Mike wasn't breathing and was very cold. There was no doubt he was no longer alive. Moreover, the marks on his neck had disappeared. Matt wasn't sure what to do. Ben thought it best to call Constable Parkins and not mention anything about vampires. Dr. Cody examined the body. When Matt asked what the Glick's son had deceased, the doctor explained it was due to a condition where red blood cells didn't have time to produce. This illness wasn't contagious, so in Cody's opinion, there couldn't be any connection between these two deaths. That same night, Mark woke up to a knock. His friend, looking like a zombie, was asking for permission to enter. Mark was horrified but under hypnosis, obediently opened the window. Danny, with glowing yellow eyes, flew into the room, telling Mark that Master Barlow wanted to meet him. Grabbing a cross, Mark managed to drive the vampire away and quickly shut the window, vowing to free Danny. After that, Mark began studying whatever literature he had on vampires, mainly comic books. He knew vampires feared crosses, avoided sunlight, and could hypnotize others. If Barlow were destroyed, all his servants would be freed. Meanwhile, Matt was studying more serious literature on vampires when a creaking floorboard interrupted him. Turning around, Matt saw Mike and quickly grabbed a cross. The vampire was instantly repelled. Matt continued holding the cross outstretched, moving from room to room. At one point Mike attacked him from behind, and Matt dropped the cross. Mike pushed the man down the stairs, urging him to join them and serve Master Barlow. Mike slowly approached. Matt managed to reach the cross and finally chase the vampire away. The nurse informed Dr. Cody that Marjorie Glick's body was found this morning. Additionally, Mike Ryerson's body was missing from the morgue. Cody went to Matt Burke's house and found him injured on the floor. Upon learning that Marjorie Glick had passed away and Mike was missing, Matt told Cody about the vampires. Ben and Susan confirmed his story. Everything pointed to Straker carrying out Barlow's orders during the day. The Glicks and Mike were only the first victims. Naturally, Cody was skeptical about this theory. Since Mike's body was missing and Danny was already buried, they could only confirm it with Marjorie's body. It was decided to head to the morgue after nightfall. But Matt wouldn't go, intending to conduct his own investigation into Barlow and Straker. First Matt watched the antique store, then went to the Marston house, unaware that Straker had noticed him. Meanwhile, Mark came to the same place and broke into the cellar. The school principal tried to warn the boy, but it was too late. Straker locked the cellar from the outside, and so Matt and Mark were trapped. All they could do was try to find another way out. The cellar led into the house, but there was no staircase. While the head vampire emerged from his coffin, Matt helped Mark climb up. Before they could take any further action, Barlow grabbed Matt, and Straker grabbed Mark. At the morgue, Cody examined Marjorie's body, but it yielded no answers. Cody was convinced that vampire stories were merely tales, but Ben and Susan were doubtful. Suddenly Marjorie began showing signs of life and calling for Danny. In terror, Cody made a cross out of whatever materials were at hand, but it had no effect. Marjorie, lying under the sheet, rose up. Ben and Susan frantically tried to secure the fragments of the makeshift cross while vampire Marjorie slowly approached. Only when they recited a prayer did the cross gain protective power. However, it quickly broke, and Marjorie attacked Cody. Ben tried to pull the vampire off, but she was too strong. Susan reassembled the cross and managed to drive the monster away, but by then, Cody had already been bitten. She thought a rabies shot might prevent the infection. Ben recited a prayer and pressed the cross to Cody, but nothing happened. It seemed the shot had indeed worked. Ben suggested they visit Father Callahan at the church tomorrow, where they'd find everything they needed: crucifixes, holy water and more. But first they'd find Matt. On the roof of the school principal's house, Ben spotted vampires and realized they were too late. It seemed Matt had been captured. Meanwhile, Straker was triumphant, intent on completing Hubert Marston's mission. However, Mark managed to get out and take Straker's life. Father Callahan believed Cody, Ben and Susan's story about vampires. Long ago, the priest had also witnessed something supernatural. Suddenly Mark entered the church, stating that Mr. Burke was now one of them. Mark wanted to fight the vampires, and for that, he needed holy water. Everyone was shocked to learn that Mark had taken down Barlow's chief servant, Straker. The team of vampire hunters headed straight to the Marston house. While Cody went upstairs, the door to the basement opened by itself. Mark explained that it was there that Barlow had captured Mr. Burke. The stairs were only on the outside. Everyone except Cody descended into the basement, hearing ominous sounds. When vampire Matt attacked, Ben used an aspen stake but missed. Everyone rushed to flee. Grabbing Ben, Matt declared that tonight Barlow would come for all of them and their families. When Susan opened the cellar doors, sunlight immediately injured the vampire. Grabbing an aspen stake, Ben finished what he'd started. Cody intended to go to Constable Parkins. The others would warn their families and take them to safety at the church. It was half an hour before sunset, so they had to act fast. Rumors about vampires had already reached Parkins, so he was planning to leave town immediately. Parkins believed the town was dead, just like Barlow, which was why the vampire could so easily take it over. Anne was not pleased when her daughter brought Ben to their home and told him to get out. Ben didn't argue. Instead, he hid and overheard Anne telling her daughter that she had met a wonderful man whom she had sworn to serve and protect during the day while he slept. Of course it was about Barlow. Before Ben could react, the vampire bit Susan. Ben hurried to take her away, and Anne grabbed a rifle. The priest told Mark's family the whole truth. His parents didn't believe it until the vampire broke into their home and bit them. After that, Barlow convinced Callahan that he was no longer a true priest. Prayers and the cross ceased to have any effect. Meanwhile, Mark ran as fast as he could, hearing Callahan's screams. Mark climbed into the treehouse where he used to play with his friends. Danny and other vampire children tried to persuade Mark to invite them inside, But he already knew it was a trap. This town was now crawling with vampires. Ben brought Susan to the church, where Cody was already waiting. The rabies shot was the only way to avoid turning, but for Susan it was already too late. Ben didn't want to lose the beloved. Taking advantage of his hesitation, vampire Susan escaped. Ben followed her, despite Cody's attempts to convince him otherwise. He found himself on the road surrounded by vampires and rushed back to the church. Cody tossed him an aspen stake as a weapon. Together with the cross, this bought them enough time to lock themselves inside the church. Ben explained that Susan's mother had become Barlow's new servant. As for the sheriff, he hadn't managed to leave town in time and had become a treat for the vampires. By dawn the streets were empty. Cody and Ben planned to find any survivors. Unfortunately at the Petrie house, they only found bodies, but Mark had left a note. Now the boy had nothing left to lose, and his only goal was to rid the world of Barlow. Mark broke into the antique shop with an aspen stake in hand. Suddenly Danny attacked him. Mark was forced to use the stake, thus freeing his friend. Ben and Cody found Mark. Now while it was daytime, all the vampires were hiding in dark places. Mark suggested they take care of Barlow before he enslaved other towns. Most likely the vampires were hiding somewhere big enough to hold all the town's residents. Ben noticed that all the cars had disappeared from the streets. They would need a lot of stakes. The vampire hunters arrived at the open-air cinema. Their suspicions were confirmed. The vampires were hiding there. With only a little time until sunset, Ben only wanted to find Susan, who was sleeping in the trunk of her car as if it were a coffin. Ben realized he couldn't harm her. Cody told him that this was no longer Susan. Taking the aspen stake, Cody was about to do what was necessary, but a gunshot ended her life. It was Anne, Barlow's devoted servant, who had sworn to protect the vampires. Ben and Mark barely managed to dodge the shots, hiding behind the cars. As the sun was nearly set, the trunks of all the cars began opening simultaneously. The vampires were coming out to hunt. Ben and Mark ran, fighting off the vampires. While Ben was grabbed, Mark started one of the cars and accelerated, knocking down the movie screen. The vampires lost their sun protection and burst into flames. Anne was about to finish Ben off once and for all, but Mark hit her with the car. The sun was nearly down. This was their last chance to get rid of Barlow. Ben and Mark found his coffin, which was securely closed. They didn't manage to open it before sunset and were forced to hide. Suddenly vampire Susan attacked them. Ben was forced to fight his beloved while Mark fled from Barlow. Ben had no choice but to use the aspen stake on Susan. Life faded from her eyes. Only Barlow remained. Mark hid, hearing ominous sounds all around. The boy guessed that if all the car headlights were turned on, it would repel the vampire, but Barlow grabbed him. Fortunately Ben arrived in time to help the boy, destroying the master vampire. Now there was not a single living soul left in this town except for Ben and Mark. They were going to leave Jerusalem's lot for good. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel not to miss more exciting new products. Also, the authors will be pleased if you leave your opinion in the comments.